toward improving your legacy software. Thank you for joining us today. Let me go ahead and put the slides up in presentation mode. A second here with the software to update. All right, a little technical glitch here. So we're just going to, we'll leave it in this mode and broadcast from here. But thank you all for joining us. We are a company called Expiro. We are located, headquartered in Texas, both in Austin and Houston, but we have clients all over the world. We work across many different industries and touch almost every continent, I think, except Antarctica at this point. My name is Lynn Pozick. I'm a co-founder of Expiro, so I wear lots of different hats around here, but my first love, near and dear to my heart, is user experience. And that's some of what I'll be talking about today in the process of modernizing legacy software. And I'd like to introduce my colleague, Scott Heath. Scott, do you want to say hi? Scott, can you hear me? Hold on a second here. Scott, can you hear me?
I can.
All right, awesome. I apologize about that. Go ahead, Scott.
It's always good to talk to yourself. It's very important to do that. Hi, I'm Scott. I'm also part of the practice at Expiro and been both a software product manager as well as a consultant. So I've seen both sides of the legacy application in a SaaS application as well as in a larger legacy application, but excited to chat with everyone today.
Great. So real quick, just a little bit of background about what we do and how it fits into modernization. So we're a software consultancy and we work on many different kinds of software across industries. But one thing that unifies the type of work we do is that we tend to focus on software in domains that have some type of complexity to them. So if you look at this table here on the far left, things that are simpler like static websites, even kind of mid-range, if you think about e-commerce, a lot of B2C, that's not really our focus. Our focus as a company is more on the higher end as things get more complicated. So we're talking about enterprise software. We're typically talking about technology used by domain experts, so scientists and engineers. We're talking about large scale problems, so truly big data, scientific computing, HPC scale solutions. That's the space that we play in. And we have a wide range of capabilities, all the way from helping our clients define what they want to build and who they're going to build it for, so understanding their user audience, all the way through building prototypes to implementation and realization. We also offer product architecture. We do training and seminars like today. And we also have a graph practice where we focus on helping our clients often get up and running on graph databases, modeling graph data.
Hey, Lynn, could you share your screen? That'd be super.
Okay, is it coming through now? I just reshared it.
So much better.
Awesome. So it's a quick flash to the space that we play in and our capabilities. Great. Well, and we have clients all over the world, large companies, small companies, lots of different industries. And we have many partners as well. So some of them are technology partners. And we ourselves are technology agnostic. We work with lots of different kinds of technologies. I guess I'll flash back really quick here so you can see our smiling faces and the broadcast of who's talking to you today. And this seminar today is part of a series on modernizing legacy software. So if you find yourself in client server or some other situation, moving from client server to the cloud. Today, we're focusing on 5 ways to get started. Modernizing is a journey. And today we're going to focus on getting started. We have a couple of other seminars in the series. Later in June, we're going to be talking in detail about modernizing product architecture and data, a little bit on operations and infrastructure. That's going to be on June 27th. And then in July, we're going to talk more about the business case of examining modernization and thinking about total cost of ownership and achieving ROI if you're going to modernize. Okay, so let's jump into it and talk about modernization. What does it mean to modernize? So, in many cases, whenever we encounter a client who has some legacy software, they're in a situation where it's kind of holding them back from achieving what they want to achieve from a business standpoint. Or maybe they're running into an external force, which is causing them to want to examine modernization. So maybe their technology is built on something that's going to be sunset. Maybe their user base has started eroding over time. Maybe they're losing customers to competitors. Some cases, we see applications that the legacy application may do a lot more than a competitor's application, but nonetheless, people are moving to the competition because maybe it's easier to use, it looks better. Maybe they have a SaaS model. There's something more desirable, even though it does a little less. Sometimes it's difficult to keep up with staffing for legacy technologies. So, going out there and recruiting COBOL programmers, not an easy task. Also, if you're dealing with on-premise legacy infrastructure, that can get increasingly costly to maintain. It can mean longer cycles between being able to release. So there's lots of reasons why people start to look at examining their legacy software. So typically, or say often, we walk into a situation where it can be quite overwhelming. People, there's a lot of choices to be made whenever you start to think about modernizing, or especially around technology. There's a lot of different options out there to explore, and it can be very overwhelming trying to determine what technology you should bet on and what's going to be right for you. And so we like to say, great, welcome to the jungle of modern technology. And we have some special things that we do that help to cut through the noise, cut through the clutter, to enable our clients to move through faster and make some decisions. So it's important to kind of go into this with the mindset that although what you can see, as in your UI, is not the only thing that you need to consider when you're thinking about modernizing legacy software. Just putting some lipstick on your UI, just because it looks better, often that's not going to get you to where you need to be in terms of achieving your business goals. Also, starting on the back end and coming up with a great plan for how you're going to migrate all of the technology, but ignoring your front end is also not a great way to go. Having a detailed plan for that stuff is good, but it needs to work in concert with other things. So what we have honed is a modernization framework, and this is something that we've honed over many years in the field, working through all different types of legacy technology scenarios, where we start off with getting our clients to think about what their motivation is. Why do they want to modernize? So a few slides ago, some of those different questions I posed as to why you would want to modernize. What is the driver? So is it a business driver? Are you trying to cut costs? Are you trying to go and maybe get a new audience, go out for greenfield audience members? Are you being forced into a modernization decision because you have some technology that's come to end of life? Is it functional? Are you needing to make a change in order to remain competitive and to retain, your user audience? So those are some things to think about. Once you figure out what your motivation and what your drivers are, uh, modernization really is, if you want to think about it as a stack, like a technology stack, plus a few other strategic things. It's really addressing from top to bottom that full stack of software. So lipstick isn't going to cut it, coming in on any one of these levels in detail and ignoring the others. Is probably not going to get you to where you want to go either. And so working through this modernization checklist is a way to create an informed strategy that you can use as guidelines for making decisions on your technology. We found is really the way to go. And we're going to go through this checklist in more detail here in the next 30 minutes or so in the webinar. But some of the things that you want to consider as your overarching strategy, you do want to look at your user experience. You want to think about, of course, your technology, your data, your operations, your infrastructure, thinking about your process. How do you want to deploy? How do you deploy today versus how would you like to deploy? How often would you like to deploy in the future? And how are you going to realize your vision? How are you going to bring that into production? And then what about your team? Are there going to be skills gaps in your team once you have some more modern software in play that you need to close? These are all things that need to be at least thought through and addressed that culminate in a modernization strategy. So another thing that having a modernization strategy can be really great for is accelerating your journey to modernizing your legacy technologies. So often what we'll see happen is people kind of get into this cycle of, we like to say they're running a lot of science experiments. So they start to play around with some of these more modern technologies, let's say, and they get into this cycle, these lengthy cycles where they're experimenting for long periods of time, and they're trying to ramp on the technology and also get something out the door and close skills gaps. And they're really kind of spinning their wheels and not making a lot of progress. If you come in and you clean that up a little bit and apply that framework that we just went through, it looks something more like this, where you think about really what your motivations are and what you need to address. You use the checklist to be able to assess for any given item on that checklist where you are and what you need to address. You exit with a sound strategy. You close your skills gaps, and now you're ready to start to think about applying that to your release planning and your release, and actually building a new modern version of your technology and getting that out the door. So another way to think about that journey, if you're on this webinar, there is a good chance that you could be in the thick of things, or maybe you're just starting to dip your toe in the water, thinking about modernizing a piece of technology. You might be here kind of realizing that you need to modernize. The next stop is getting into assessing where your technology is, and that's really kind of going through this checklist here, assessing the status of all of these different levels in your technology to arrive at a plan, and then executing that strategy along with your release. Okay. Now I want to talk about, there's some different approaches to modernization, and this kind of gets to that first piece of the framework of thinking about what really is your motivation for wanting to modernize. And so there are really kind of three fundamental approaches that we typically encounter, and then some other things that kind of play nicely with these approaches that you can choose to combine with any of these approaches. So the three approaches are: do you want to modernize? Do you want to modernize and enhance? And do you want to do something innovative? Do you want to really leapfrog your competition and own your space? So let's get into those a little bit more. So the first approach in thinking about what you want to achieve, your mantra there is really kind of do the minimum. You maybe need to safeguard against technology that's being end of life, but for the most part, maybe you're in a space where your users are kind of happy with the status quo. You're not seeing a lot of customer churn. And so your motivations really are to deal with this end of life technology situation. So your goals there might be to really just minimize the impact to your business, to your customers, to your team. And your goal is really to exert minimal effort. You might do a little bit of improvement where maybe you had some inefficiencies, maybe you had some usability issues, maybe you had a few performance issues or something that you want to tie a bow on. But for the most part, your mantra there is kind of do the minimum. So the next approach is modernizing and then enhancing. And enhancements can take lots of different forms. As an example, we've now added in a mobile medium of delivery as well. And there can be lots of motivations. It could be business, it could be technology, it could be a functional motivation of why people tend to land with this approach. People are usually, in this case, using the modernization event as an opportunity to advance the offering, the technology across many different fronts. So you might be trying to address an eroding user base. Maybe you're losing deals to your competition. Maybe you also aren't able to, deploy as effectively or as often as you want. But your main goals for this case are often to stop the bleeding in terms of customer churn, or maybe even address a shifting of your user audience over time. Maybe the demographic has shifted slightly. You're probably going to be thinking about incorporating new features and new functionality rather than just doing the status quo and the bare minimum. You might be adding different mediums like mobiles or different ways of accessing the technology. And you're going to have goals that include taking advantage of the opportunity and doing many different improvements. This is where you're going to start to really care about maybe impacting total cost of ownership, looking at different infrastructure possibilities, maybe moving to the cloud, and figuring out ways to also optimize a little bit more. The third approach, these are folks that really care about moving from where they are to leapfrogging across just enhancing to innovation. So you see an opportunity in your space with this legacy audience to do something really revolutionary. Maybe you want to expand that legacy audience to a new greenfield audience. You want to revolutionize your industry. Maybe it's ripe for doing something new. So your mantra is really visionary and innovation. And most of what you're doing is going to be not only to improve, but also to innovate. You want to not only retain your existing customers, you want to delight them, you want to make them loyal, and you probably want to expand that audience a bit and go for some greenfield customers. You're definitely adding new functionality, new approaches, new technology. You might even be exploring radically different technology. If you're on a relational database, maybe you're interested in exploring a graph database, for example. So you're doing a lot of things. You're really interested in pushing the envelope, in addition to thinking about how you could improve the usability, improve how you develop the technology and deploy it in a total cost of ownership. Now, with those three categories, especially the enhance and the innovation category, you can combine this with these two other approaches. And the first approach is thinking about what you want to build versus what you want to buy, or we could also say utilize open source, depending on your tolerance for that. you want to be thinking about what is your core competency? What do you really want to build when you're modernizing versus what can you utilize off the shelf and maybe customize a little bit or just incorporate? For example, there are a lot of really small SaaS companies that offer very specific services that you could incorporate into your more modern technology, lower your cost of ownership, and deploy faster by utilizing services. We have a few examples up here, like login services or integration services, but there's tons of them out there. And that can really accelerate your progress and save you a lot of time and effort. Another example that's kind of a canonical one is BI tools. So that is business intelligence tools as well as front-end libraries and packages for being able to visualize information. So if you have a lot of things in tabular form, a lot of data tables, let's say, and you're interested in having a dashboard in your application or more interactive reporting in your new modern application, looking at BI tools and off-the-shelf components could be a great way for you to go. Also, often with these tools, you get a mobile version for free already baked in, which is quite nice. So some quick examples of that, and we're technology agnostic. We're not advocating any one of these particular technologies, but just to give you an example, there are a lot of nice lightweight options that generate all sorts of visualization possibilities. Depending on the kind of data that you have, if you're a little more geospatially inclined, you might be interested in some of these tools that have some nice features where you can easily visualize your georeferenced information as well as overlay other information on top of it. So, and then the last approach that again can be combined with any of the first three approaches is thinking about how you might incrementally modernize. And by that we mean being able to incrementally modernize pieces of your application. So yes, you could have an incremental process, but that's not really what we mean here. It's more about thinking about service by service, being able to pick key things that you might want to start to identify in your product architecture as things that you could start to turn into individual services that could be pushed out to start to make headway faster. One caution with this approach is it can be very tempting to get mired sort of in the technology and all these cool little services that you can put together. We want to be careful and make sure that when you do that and you start delivering incrementally, you're doing it in a way where you're delivering value to the end users. So we want to have some guardrails on there, thinking in terms of if you do agile at scale, like safe agile or some flavor of that, you might think in terms of value streams. So you would want to think about incrementally breaking off pieces of your product architecture that aligned to delivering a value stream, or maybe an epic, or maybe you've done some story mapping, but you want to keep that in mind. Just delivering, a wheelbarrow of services isn't necessarily valuable just because you got it out there faster. So you got to make sure to pair the two. Okay, so with the 5 strategies, once you're understanding your motivation and thinking about what you have an appetite for in terms of, do you want to remain status quo, do you want to modernize and enhance, or are you looking to do something really innovative, now we can start to think about the journey and how we move through that journey. And so we're really talking now about the next 2 steps here, which is assessing where you are and getting to a modernization strategy. So one way of starting to assess where you are is going through a checklist using ours or create your own, but making sure that you have full stack coverage as well as covering some of that softer stuff, like thinking about your team and your skills modernization, thinking about how you actually want to roll out the technology, how you do that today versus how your infrastructure and your rollout plans might need to change. So if we start in down the checklist here to inform our strategy, the first topic I want to talk about in a little more depth is thinking about the business aspects and the product strategy. And I'll turn over to Scott here for a couple of minutes to talk about this.
Thanks, Lynn. Um, I think this really hits home in a couple of different categories, which is specifically, we were talking with a customer yesterday, and the customer had a room filled with executives, MBAs, folks that had been to design school, and the topic was design thinking. And as the one customer person said, you know, it's the most difficult thing we have is trying to identify our internal users and or getting our executives on the same page. So where I'm going with that point is this first bullet, although seemingly straightforward, can sometimes be the trickiest. And some of the questions we have listed here is underneath that business and product strategy, which is this driven because you're losing revenue, or is your new sales pipeline or funnel falling flat? Are people selecting your platform, or are you losing customers? So is this more of a defensive or a reactionary kind of an approach? The other item here now is, what are those features that you're trying to add, and is it costing you even more money to use a platform that you have today to try and catch up? Or are you now sort of seeing that other products or other categories out in the market are doing things where they can do it faster? Some of these projected growth elements, et cetera. But I'm hoping the point here now is to start to evaluate why you're doing this, because it can also create a filter for where you're going to go as you build your roadmap and what things matter as you start to put that together. And so real quick on our next slide, what we start to see then is you need to open up your aperture a little bit, which is what is the industry that your product is in. If you're in financial services, specifically, what is the market doing? What are your competitors doing in the industry? Are there other case studies of products or technology that's really being brought to bear that may affect what it is you're trying to do in this modernization? The second one is really this tough one, which is internally. Do you have stakeholders, and do you have vision match? Are your internal stakeholders actually fighting against you? Are they saying, and the classic example then is of Kodak, which is, yeah, they knew about digital photography. They even had some digital projects that were underway. They knew that this digital technology was taking off, but you know, I don't know about this digital camera phase. It's just a fad. It's going to go away. And of course, we all know what happened. So here, there may be some internal capability that you have to bring up to speed, if you will, on how the rest of the world is seeing that. And that's where we get down into the market. Specifically now, what are these other technologies that are out there? Advents of AWS and in-memory computing have really, really vastly dropped the price for some of the infrastructure. So if your application is very process intensive, is there now a capability to save a large amount of money by using some of these other technologies that are out there? But again, it's looking around you. And then the other thing that I want to touch on now are whether it's analysts, internal or external, which is this ability to do gap analysis. Is your product in the driving sector? Maybe you're a startup and you don't know where your product is, but you suspect that your features are out there. But the most important one that we're now seeing is this advent of the social product ranking. Just because you're leading and you see it in Gartner, you may not know that there's actually a social area where you are not actually scored as well as you think you are, et cetera. Taking all of these different elements by what I call looking at the rest of the world can really, really help you define what strategy to go with. As Len mentioned, there were 3 categories. Are you trying to leapfrog? Or are you really just trying to keep status quo and keep your customers on board? But this is a quick checklist of looking out and around you before you jump off. In our next slide, some of our larger enterprise kinds of applications, you may end up coming back with a scorecard that's quite simple, which is you have a series of products or you have modules where you really do need to follow. It's okay, your product is actually out there and you have some killer design features, et cetera. And then you actually have some ones where they're following. Maybe those are the ones that are potentially the ones for leapfrogging or that ability to really jump out in front of them. And then if you're maintaining, in some cases, maybe that space or module isn't really defining that. But this is not uncommon with more enterprise software, which is this scorecard of how you approach that. And then what is your strategy going to be per module, if not per software. Our next slide can start you to effectively then do that analysis. This is that, either subjective or objective, the couple of ways that you can do this. You may have a user community, and you see here we're using some softwares over here where you can go out and talk to these users. You can actually go out and subjectively ask your customers when they were perhaps doing a buy decision, if it's not too far ago. You can get some of this information, but you can start to give yourself an unbiased scorecard where you can start to realize that, you know what, if you're not the leader in some of these, then maybe you need to dig in a little deeper. But at least the ability to create a scorecard as you're looking at the sector and your market to be able to do these kinds of things. Just because you're a very good looking application doesn't mean you're perhaps always useful or as useful as the application needs to be. And as you look at these scorecards, this is yet another element to layer on top how you drive your roadmap and where you're going. The next one that I want to, in the next slide here, what I want to do is indicate something that that has really become an advent here recently, which is something called G2 Crowd. What this is a Gartner style quadrant. However, this information is actually driven from the users. G2, be careful. In my previous life as a product manager, we found out that G2 was extremely powerful in the way decisions were made, which is these are card-carrying users of your product and or card-carrying users of other products, and they score your features, your functionalities against these other ones, and this dynamic can look very different than what a Gartner is. Now, Gartner obviously does a great job in trying to set the vision and those kinds of things, but Gartner's not the only game in town. So some of these other elements, as you look in that, can absolutely help you set your table by looking out in the world around you for what you're going to do inside of your roadmap. Okay, I'll hand it back to Lynn.
All right. To dovetail with that, when you're thinking about users scoring you, that's a perfect segue to the next item on our checklist, which is talking about user experience and thinking about the things that you need to consider for modernization. So a few things here. Thinking about how well your existing application really supports your users and your business goals. Maybe 10 years ago it supported them really well. Is that still true today? Or is there missing functionality compared to your competition? Is there something that your users, your competition also isn't always who you think it is? Is there something that your users do today in Excel that takes them outside of your application? Are they growing increasingly dependent on that? And you have an opportunity to bring them back into the fold by having some of that functionality in your application. Does your navigation scale well? Have you gone through, say, acquisitions over time? Do you have kind of a Frankenstein navigation where people might have multiple logins instead of single sign-on and they're popping in and out, trying to find their way? Or your menus really deep? Does it take 7 clicks to get anywhere because you've had to bolt things together over time as your app has grown? And is it really clear what you should do on each screen? So maybe there are things that were put into your app for a specific user audience that other audiences have picked up over time, but maybe way it works and the content that's present to instruct the user isn't as clear as it could be, because now you have new audience members using that same functionality for whom it wasn't originally intended. What about your visual design? What does it look like? So maybe it's legacy and it looks dated. But what about your corporate brand? In the last decade plus, has your corporate brand changed much? Is it homogenous with your website and your other materials? Does it feel like it's disconnected from your other materials? Or again, if you've been through an acquisition and you need to figure out how to homogenize many different brands so that it really feels like one brand and one company. And so, again, now tying in UX with the rest of your modernization considerations. Some of the things that you want to think about here at each level. This stack representation is how we tend to think about user experience, where there are many things that need to work together in harmony to have a successful user experience, whether you're modernizing or not. The most basic of which are the two orange bars on the bottom is understanding who your user audience is. So who is your audience today? Who would your audience be in the future, depending on the strategy that you're working under? If you want to do something innovative and leapfrog, then you're probably going to have some greenfield users. So your audience is going to be changing, right? Thinking about what functionality to add, who your audience is or will be, and the functionality that you're going to deliver or continue to deliver. Those are the fundamentals. When it comes to user experience, we could spend a lot of time thinking about those other blue boxes, making it easy to use and easy to navigate and making it look great and all that. But if your user audience and your functionality are not well understood and well defined, it doesn't matter how much time we spend on making it easy to use. So, excuse me, you want to make sure that you get those base layers down first. So, and as we go up the stack here, some of these I touched on in the previous slide, but thinking about, your information architecture, how does it need to scale? How does it need to scale maybe differently than your current application? UI frameworks. So if you're on a legacy app, you may have just kind of inherited the UI library, let's say, that went with that application. If you're in VB, it has VB-based components. If you're in Java, it has Java components. Now, on the web, there are many different UI frameworks that you could take advantage of. They also typically have responsiveness built into them and some other goodies. And then finally, homogenizing the visual brand, as I said before. So think about your user audience. So those two base layers, is your user base changing? Or maybe is the demographic just shifting in your user base? Maybe you're still going after the same types of roles and job titles, but maybe the demographic is shifting. So are you going for new users, a greenfield audience? Kind of a word here to take a moment on shifting demographics that we see often now in enterprise software, and that is the millennials entering the enterprise workforce. The millennial demographic has a very different expectation than traditional legacy users. They are comparing your multi-million-dollar enterprise application that delivers terabytes of data with their iPhone. They expect it to be as easy to use as their favorite mobile application on their Android, their iPhone, pick your device. And that is how they are going to judge your multi-million-dollar application. Millennials are far less likely to just use something because it's indoctrinated. The management says they need to use it. And what Scott showed a minute ago with the G2 crowdsourcing, you better believe millennials are out there voting, and they're voting on your app, and they're letting their voices be known. It's a very different audience than legacy audiences that you may be used to. So Now focusing on kind of the center of the stack here, so the what it does, and then how the user is going to move around, how the architecture, the information architecture might need to scale, and thinking about UI frameworks. Some things to think about with your legacy application. When it was built, it may have been built with or without the user in mind. This idea of design thinking and user-centered design is, not it's been around for a while, but if you have an application that's 10, 15 years ago, it may have been driven more from the technology outward of, here's what the logic and the data model can do. So this is the way our app works versus how does the user really think about it? Let's have some empathy for the user, put ourselves in their shoes, and let's try to model our navigation and our experience in that light. And there are lots of different techniques for getting inside the heads of end users to improve your user experience. What I pictured here is an example of a fun little artifact called mental modeling, which is sort of a tangible documentation of how the user might think about approaching, a workflow or a task in an application. These little boxes kind of represent different things along the way of the task. But the salient point here, the goal is we really want to think like our users, and we want to be able to align the way that the system is going to work with the way that the user would think about it. And so Scott was talking a minute ago about assessing and scorecarding. So in addition to scoring against your competitors, also thinking about how your user really wants to complete a task or achieve a goal in your technology versus the way it works today. And the navigation that you have today. So that is also another interesting thing another lens to put on it and get in there in your application and really take a hard look at that whenever you're modernizing. It's an opportunity to go in and clean that up and have our application work and behave and support more of the way that the user would want it to work. Another element to user experience to consider, as I mentioned, is UI frameworks and libraries. There are lots of different frameworks out there. All of them have pros and cons associated with them. But overall, one of the things that's great about all of these frameworks is that they will make for a far more consistent user experience. You will have less of individual developers kind of rolling their own components and rolling their own behaviors and look and feel. So overall, it'll feel like it hangs together better if you have a team choose a particular framework to work within on the front end. And then when you pair it with, as we talked about earlier, some lightweight technologies for visualization, it can be very powerful. So as we get to the top of the stack here, thinking about user experience, the visual design. So not only homogenizing your visuals, I mentioned, is there a disconnect between where your brand is today and where your app is if it still looks like your brand of 10 years ago? But there's also a more serious implication of an application that looks dated. And we hear this a lot where customers, prospects, they have this sort of visceral reaction when they see something that looks dated. They start to think, oh, is the technology, is the science, are the algorithms behind this thing also dated? Do I need to be concerned about that? It's not just the look and the feel. It can have more serious implications on your offering and your brand. So another thing to kind of consider to wrap up thinking about your user experience is user adoption risk. So if you're going to roll out a new modernized application, thinking about your existing user audience or your intended future audience and where there might be some risk there in rolling that out. And there are ways that you can get in here and more quantitatively actually come up with scores and a plot like the one here on the left. We could talk a whole seminar just about that. But to take that up a level, some questions for you to think about on the right, that if you answer yes to any one of these, you probably need to give some thought to user adoption risk, and that is if your audience is shifting or changing, and if you know very little about the new demographic, or if you're going for greenfield, if you don't know a lot about your users and how they want to approach tasks and perform in your application, that's a risk. Navigation that doesn't map to how the user wants to do things. Navigation that's Frankenstein and very inefficient, that's a risk. Competition has something different that you don't have that might appeal to one demographic over another, like a mobile solution, for example. Not being able to keep up with that appeal could also be a risk. And then the data UI reflecting poorly on your real value proposition, which could be a piece of science, a piece of engineering, an algorithm, and you don't want to put that at risk either with your user audience. Okay. The last bit that we want to talk about here today, and we're just going to touch on it, is starting to think about strategies around your technology and data. And I say we're just going to touch on it because I mentioned earlier on, this is a webinar series, and we want to make sure that we give technology, data, and infrastructure, all of the proper examination that deserves. So in June 27th, we have a whole webinar dedicated just to that and those considerations. But just to touch on it a little bit today, some food for thought. Thinking about, how has your application performed? Has it typically been performant enough, or did it perform really well 10 years ago and maybe now it's gotten slower over time? Has it scaled very well? Has it been reliable? Was it pretty cost effective whenever it was first released, but now how is your total cost of ownership versus have you actually done an investigation to see total cost of ownership for moving to the cloud or some more modern infrastructure, even if it's an on-premise, a more modern on-premise solution versus your TCO for the current system. Is it going to be easier if you change technologies to retain and recruit talent? For your system? Are you using the right tools for the job? Do you have the right data strategy, data architecture, database in place for what you're trying to achieve? And some things that we're going to touch on again in the next webinar are strategies and methods for starting to look at, well, what pieces of technology do we need to keep? What can we retire versus what do we maybe need to rewrap? How do we want to map what we have today in the context we have today to the future context of our new application? Our modernized application. How many products do we actually have? Is our legacy app, again, one where over time we've kind of got this Frankenstein where we've bolted lots of different products and things together, and it turns out really the way we're selling today and the way that people use our app, it turns out it would be better if we kind of broke this into separate products or modules. Do we want to move to a more service-oriented architecture so we could take advantage of some of these great SaaS offerings that are out there and microservices? And thinking about architecture as well, we're going to talk a bit about being able to do some benchmarking in some sensible ways to be able to do that and spot areas for concern and compare. And then finally, again, just a reminder that we talked about with the incremental approach, when you think about your technology, your data, your infrastructure, it can be easy to get mired in all this technology. Again, whatever our technology strategy is going to be, we want to make sure, especially if we decide to deliver incrementally, that we have a valuable path that we're delivering incrementally. So we're delivering business value along with our features and functionality to our user audience. Okay, so that is our webinar for today. I wanted to open up now to questions, if we have anybody on the line that has questions.
Hey, Lynn, I've got a couple questions coming in here.
Okay.
The first one was, is there a product-specific playbook In our world, we're using a combination of .NET and some older Microsoft elements.
Yes, that is a great question, and that's something that we're going to be covering in that next webinar, where we're going to look at a couple of common legacy technologies, and then pathways forward for those technologies for sure. We run into a lot of .NET with clients, and we're we have some prescriptions that we know work.
Okay, looks like I've got another question here, which is our product is an on-premise, and today you spoke a little bit about software as a service. Is there something different or any things that we either don't need to think about or do need to think about differently if we're on-premise versus SaaS?
You can be on-premise and SaaS as well. We run into that too, but it depends on if you want to stay. Do you want to stay on-premise? Do you want to look at doing something in the cloud? Do you want to do something locally where maybe if you're big enough, you're running your own cloud. So the first thing would be to figure out if there is an option there. Do you want to stay on premise or do you want to move? Do you want to get in there and investigate and look at what life would be like in terms of the frequency at which you could deploy, the total cost of ownership. If you have whatever your product or service is, if you need to be able to quickly ramp up and ramp down infrastructure, that might point you towards more of a cloud solution. There's a lot of cost benefit to that. So stage gate one would be analyzing. There's no magic bullet there of if you're on premise that you should always stay on premise, or if you're on premise that you should always move to the cloud. Sometimes the cloud is not the right answer either.
Okay, and it looks like I got one final question, which says that on Lynn's earlier slides, she showed the playbook. Is there an approximate time frame and cost if somebody were to use an Xperio to help build that playbook or roadmap?
Scotty, do you want to take that question? The short answer is it depends.
Sure. Well, I think, the way Xperio works is our process is, number one, flexible, such that we try and outline all of the elements before we get in and make a decision. So unfortunately, based on your inputs, your mileage may vary. But typically on the short side, a 3-week kind of an assessment, and on the high side, depending on a very large enterprise kind of application, can take 6 weeks. And again, this becomes a living process that goes forward. It's not just a one-time kind of an event, but 3 to 6 weeks is typical. And again, our cost, depending on whether we're typically in a mixed team type of environment, ranges from $30,000 to $60,000, depending on whether we're working with executives and stakeholders and technical team members, or if we're brought in to do the entire thing turnkey. So that's kind of a ballpark, if you will. Okay, no more questions on this side. Did you have any more on that side?
I did not have any questions coming in. Are there any other questions? Does anybody want to put up a hand? I could. Do we have any hands up?
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. Everybody that signed up for the webinar, whether you're able to attend or not, we post the webinar to our channel on YouTube as well as our website, and we'll send you an email with a link to the recording of the webinar so that you can go back and review or share with your friends. All right.
Thanks,
Thank you very
everybody.
much. Bye.